Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 259, I chat with Brian Vessa, Executive Director for Audio Mastering at Sony Pictures, about the process of mastering movie audio for the home. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded June 11th, 2015. Episode 259, Mastering Movie Audio for the Home. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week, my guest geek is Brian Vessa, Executive Director of Audio Mastering at Sony Pictures, and a return guest on the show, and I'm so glad to have him back. Hey, Brian, welcome.
Hey, Scott, how you doing?
Doing great, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm great.
Good. Those who are logged into the live stream at live.twit.tv or into the chat room, which you can do from there, or at irc.twit.tv, are welcome to post questions in the chat room, and I will pass along as many as I can. So today we're talking about the process of mastering movie audio, primarily, for the home. And Brian, I'd like for you to start by telling us about the process that you undertake for all these movies. You supervise the audio mixes for home releases in your job. What is that process like, and how is it different from doing the same thing for a theatrical release?
Well, the whole reason for doing it to begin with is that if you take something that's been mixed to sound fantastic in a big room, and you got all this great volume and these great speakers and everything sounds fantastic, and the director and everybody signed off on the balance, and you go, okay, we got a great movie, and then you just take that very thing and you take it home and you play it much quieter through smaller speakers or through a TV or something, all of a sudden it just doesn't sound like the same movie. And you go, well, that's funny. I haven't changed anything. Why does it sound different? Well, the reason it sounds different is because we're very perceptually driven by volume and size and air movement and all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, our perceived balance and perceived presence on things changes greatly by the volume and size of speakers and proximity to speakers and all kinds of different things like that. So we discovered pretty early when we started bringing things at home, like when DVD first started getting going, that we would do this and we would go, oh, what happened to the mix? Everything sounds so different. And even the director started saying, oh, what did you do to my mix? I mean, I go, well, we didn't do anything to it. And then all of a sudden we realized that was the problem.
Yeah, that's
we didn't
the
do
problem.
anything to it.
Yeah.
And so then it became like, oh, okay, well, maybe we do need to do something about it. So from the time I started here.
Roughly when was that it was decided that, hey, you know what, maybe we better do something about this?
This was in 1990s. This was 1997.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, around 1997 when the DVD thing was just really kind of starting to get going. I started here in March of 1998, but I had actually done some work for Sony as a contractor before that. So really in 1997 is really when we first started with this idea that, you know, let's try to do a little rebalancing. Let's see what we need to do to make it sound better at home. Mm-hmm. And so since that time, I've supervised hundreds and hundreds of these mixes, and I've created a white paper on it that has been pretty widely available, and a lot of other places actually use my white paper because it's probably one of the few things that's actually been written down in such detail. So,
you know, I need to get a copy of that white paper. So, and is it available to the general public?
Is it available to the general public? I would say it is. I mean, I don't have it posted on a public website, but I think I could send it to you, and you could. Okay. There's nothing, you know, proprietary about content in there or anything. And anyone that's worked with me over the years knows what this is.
Right.
So, right. It's actually a good thing to have something written down, and it's actually been great that other people in the business have gone, oh, hey, this looks right. I'll try it this way. You know, Skywalker actually built an entire room up there, or converted a room into doing nothing but home theater mixes in there, basically using my specs. So I thought that was pretty
fantastic. Cool. That's great. Yeah, if you're okay with it, I'll post it on AVS and let people take a look.
Yeah, that would be cool. I'll send it to you.
Okay, cool.
So the process. So there's several things that happen when you start doing this, and it's kind of hard to know because there's not one home theater system. I mean, at least in the cinema, you sort of know what you're playing to. I mean, even though there's the arguments that different cinemas sound different and all that, which was kind of what I talked about last time I was on the show, you at least know what you're playing to. Right. And at home, you don't know what you're playing to. Somebody could have a nice 5.1 speaker setup. Somebody could have a regular TV. Somebody could have a sound bar. Somebody could, be looking at it on a tablet or phone. There's 1,000 ways. So you don't have this nice standard system. So I had to sort of develop a way of doing it. So what I do is I sort of take a two-pronged approach. I do one pass listening on a reasonably nice set of 5.1 speakers fairly near field, which we set up inside the mixing room, because usually it's the mixing stage that's got enough horsepower to do the work, because it actually does require a bit of horsepower. You can't just, do it in your bedroom. So we set the speakers up and we monitor fairly low, like usually 10 dB lower than the stated level for cinema, because what I find is even mixes are pretty hot these days. So, minus 20 is the normal level, as they say. That's like 0 VU used to be. So in a regular cinema calibration, 0 VU would give you 85 dBc weighted, which means that if you start getting up to the top of the charts on your meters, all of a sudden you're running 105, 110 dB. Well, obviously no one's doing that at home. So
well, not many anyway.
Not many anyway. I guess if you live next to the airport and the planes are taking off next to you, you might have to turn it up that much.
Yeah, exactly. Before you go on, this raises a question for me, and that is, you just mentioned that your 0 VU, sort of average level that you're aiming at, is 85 dB C weighted.
That's the cinema standard, not the home theater.
Not the home theater standard, nor is it the standard that OSHA uses, for example, for industrial sound level exposure. They use A weighting. Now, the difference between them is that C weighting takes into account the base frequencies, and A weighting, it does not nearly as much. So my question to you is, do you have any sense of why it is they use C weighting in the cinema standard, the standard that you use, but A weighting on the consumer side as opposed to the professional side?
Well, I don't know if we're using A weighting on the consumer side, but it is an interesting question in general about C weighting versus A weighting. And actually, when we really get down and measure cinemas and calibrate them, I find it's really good to use both, to actually look at what the C weighting is, look at what the A weighting is, try to get a reasonable average between the two, because depending on the program material, right, if there's a lot of low end in the material, the A weighting is not going to help you, as you said. But on the other hand, the C weighting skews things a little bit, so it doesn't really tell you what this critical area is, say from like, I don't know, say 2 to 5K, that octave in there.
Which is the speech range, which is where all your sibilants are and where all your consonants are, which leads to dialogue intelligibility.
Dialogue intelligibility, exactly. So what we usually do, and I think I mentioned in my last time on your show, we're writing a modern calibration procedure in SMPTE for telling you how to do that. You'll find in there's a great amount of detail about how using C weighting, using A weighting, how to do it, how to take an average between them and get something that's sensible.
Okay, good.
And basically what we do for the home is we try to take, first of all, the whole thing down to a more sane level. I usually bring it down to 75.
Makes sense to me.
I started off bringing it down to 80, but then as movies have generally been creeping up louder and louder, I found it was a better thing to calibrate another 5 dB down. So later I've been doing, most of the mixes I've been doing in the last couple of years, I've been using 75 as my center line. And so we set the speakers up about 10 feet away, and in a nice little arc, and then I put the surrounds kind of in the ITU format, where they're 20 degrees back from straight away. And one of the things about home theater that's a little different than cinema, most of the time the surround speakers are calibrated to the same level as the fronts, whereas in a cinema, they're 3 dB lower.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So that's kind of an interesting thing. That kind of helps because you get to understand, if the surrounds are just going to be too much for home. Because sometimes you're sitting back on your couch and you got your speakers back there. If the surrounds get too hot, then all of a sudden it's obscuring what you got coming from the front. So sometimes we make little balance shifts in there to take care of that. But anyway, like the first pass that we do, we listen on the smaller speakers, 10 dB lower. And the first thing that you usually notice is that the stuff that was nice and subtle and just kind of sat just in a really good place when you were listening in the cinema are essentially gone, or they're way low. And so, the first thing you want to do is try to sort of bring certain things up that are falling away, right? Which happens. I mean, you can see this phenomenon in a cinema today. If the cinema is not running at level, right? If the cinema has turned down,
right.
Their overall volume. Sometimes you'll go, where's the dialogue? I don't hear the dialogue, because the dialogue was mixed listening to it loud. And now if I turn the whole thing down, all of a sudden the dialogue doesn't seem to be as good. So we do a process of bringing up some of the quiet stuff. Sometimes the dialogue comes up a little bit. We tuck a little bit of the music and effects in places. There's no exact formula, but what we try to do is translate it so that all that stuff that was subtle is still hearable. And the stuff that's exciting and, coming up at a good volume, you still get a good volume, but it's not blasting you, right? You're trying to do it at a level that somebody would listen to at home. Because, the problem is that those great dynamics that you have in the cinema that really makes something cinematic, they really work against you at home, because a lot of times, when I listen to a movie at home, I just hold the remote in my hand and I just turn it up to hear the dialogue, and then the loud stuff comes in, turn it back down again,
I do the same thing, and it really drives me nuts.
Yeah. So that wonderful dynamic range works against you at home. So what we try to do is bring that dynamic range in. It's not like you're trying to do a broadcast mix where everything's about this small,
right?
But
right.
You're just bringing it in. You're kind of bringing that lower stuff up a little, so it's easier to hear. You get all the detail. You make sure you're catching all the dialogue, and you still have a nice amount of headroom at the top end for the bigger stuff. And it tends to work out better because you should be able to just sit there and listen to it and feel like, hey, I really heard the movie. I didn't have to be on my remote, but I got the visceral impression, the emotions I'm supposed to get from the movie. So that's why every movie is a little different, because every movie's kind of mixed a little differently, and you're kind of trying to attain different things with the sound design. So you have to be very you have to pay a lot of attention to what the intent of the movie is. You don't just kind of come in and go, oh, turn that up and turn that down, and here's my formula, and it goes like that, because every movie is trying to do a different thing with the sound. So you have to be very sensitive to that. And, I think I'm uniquely qualified for that, since I am a mixer. I understand all of those things. And I think that's helped me work with the other mixers. And, we talk it through, and we find a good balance that we both agree is translating the movie well and is conveying the director's intent. And that's really the main deal.
Sure. Now the fixer. Now, hang on before you go any further. There's a guy the person in the chat room. The fixer asked a question related to what you were just talking about, which you may have already answered in that last pass there. Can you ask why some movies feel the need to bury the spoken audio track, the dialogue track, so far beneath sound effects and musical scores that you can't hear what the actors are saying without disturbing your neighbors?
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? Because if you were to go to the cinema and listen to it super loud, the dialogue would probably be pretty audible. But of course, everything else is super loud, and you bring
and we're not talking about Christopher Nolan or Interstellar here, in which he admitted that he buried the dialogue in some cases.
Intentional. Yeah. That was intentional. But in general, I think that's the phenomenon, right? Because you're listening very loud in a big room through big speakers and everything, and you go, yeah, I can hear the dialogue fine. Of course, everything else is super loud, but your ears kind of work it. Your ears take care of it. But that doesn't happen at home. You start bringing everything down, and all of a sudden that dialogue becomes inaudible. Yeah. And so it's exactly what he said. So one of the big things I do in this process is to make sure that I've kind of rebalanced things a little bit, so the dialogue is completely audible. I mean, unless there was a complete intention by the director to bury a piece of dialogue, which of course you wouldn't go against their wishes. But your general dialogue, just the general dialogue in the movie, you want to make sure it's up there and plainly audible without having to crank the sound way up. So this is one of the reasons I listen quieter, because it immediately cues you as to what's going to be falling off when you listen at home.
Mm-hmm. Do you work? Does the director actually come in while you're remixing for the home to make sure that what gets delivered to the home on DVD or now Blu-ray or even streaming, and we're going to talk about that a little later, that what gets delivered to that way of distributing it is what the director intends? Do they actually show up and participate in this process?
They have, actually. I wouldn't say that it's the norm, but one of the things I always do is make sure that I work with the exact same sound crew that mixed the movie, the exact same sound supervisor. They know what the movie's supposed to sound like. They know what the director's wishes are. So, we make sure it translates. But I mean, for example, Sam Raimi on the Spider-Man movies, he came in and he said, I want to be there. I like this process and I want to make sure it works. And he sat through it and he had notes and it was great. I mean, he really understood it.
Cool.
And other directors have done the same thing. They've actually said, I want to make sure we do a home theater mix because I hear what happens to my movies when I take it at home, and it's like I can't hear the dialogue. What happened?
Yeah. My tallest 42 in the chat room is asking, how is this compared to midnight mode on an AV receiver, which is a form of dynamic compression, wherein you can turn the volume down, it compresses the dynamics, but you can hear everything in case your spouse is sleeping in the next room or your kids or whatever?
Well, it's actually quite different because this is a creative process where we actually rebalance. We go back to the stems, which is the individual dialogue, music, and effects, and we can listen to kind of how it's coming across, and we can rebalance things dynamically for different scenes and for different situations in the movie, to translate it correctly. And I try not to do any overall compression like that, because you're really audible when you do that, especially at any level. If it's really, really quiet, you don't notice the compression, but otherwise you do. Whereas the night mode is a dynamic range compression for the whole thing. It takes the whole dynamic and just puts it into a very small place. And so for that reason, it's good, but it's quite different than what you're doing with a home theater mix. Because in a home theater mix, you're actually being creative. You're actually rebalancing, re-cueing different sounds. Maybe just it's giving it more love. It's giving it more creative attention.
Mahler Music in the chat room is asking, what type of system do you mix to when you're doing the home theater mix? Do you test it on like a TV with its own sound system and a sound bar versus a full HT system? Are you using, I would add to that, are you using like a consumer AVR to power the speakers and do everything like that? Is it a real home theater system?
Well, these are really excellent questions. And as we've been going along in delivery, I start to ask more and more about how many different types of systems we might really need to be listening to as people are starting to consume their movies on smaller and smaller environments, completely different environments. But what I'm doing currently is I do two passes. I do one pass on a good set of Genelecs, which are very flat sounding and give you good detail.
Nice speakers. Yeah, really great speakers. I love them.
Yeah, use the Genelecs. And then I listen on just a regular run-of-the-mill flat screen TV, no frills, and check it there. And
and are you talking about the sound coming from the TV's little funky speakers?
Yep. Yeah. So that's the other end of the spectrum. That's taking
that is
it all
the other
way
end
down.
of the spectrum.
So I figure if you can sort of get it good between those two ends of the spectrum, you've at least got a good shot at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to talk about this later in the program, but since it came up, we have so many different playback systems in homes now compared to what we used to. I mean, the sound bar is an interesting deal. A lot of people are getting sound bars now, especially because those speakers are so funky in the TVs.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's all the people who are listening, either on their phones or through earbuds or on tablets or whatever, and people just listening through streaming and many other things. And it's a little hard to know. I mean, I can't, how many mixes can you really do? So, right now I'm just trying to say, well, if I can make it sound good at both ends of the spectrum, then I think it's going to have a pretty good translation. And that's kind of how I'm approaching it at the moment.
Right. Rusty Bones says, in my home theater, I like to wake the dead, although it is not easy reburying them.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Rusty Bones, thank you very much for that. You gave us both a good laugh there. Well, I also wanted to ask you about the environment. When you're mixing on a sound stage, a dubbing stage or whatever, you basically got a commercial-sized theater that you're mixing in, and you got the speakers behind the screen and all around you, and they're pretty far away and they're pretty big. Do you bring in these smaller speakers and set them up at the, say, 10-foot distance from the mixer within that larger acoustic space, or do you actually go into a smaller room? Well,
ideally a smaller room, but that's not always available, unfortunately. There's not very many places that you have a small room like that has the kind of horsepower and enough inputs and everything to do what we need to do. So it's a bit of a compromise. As I mentioned, Skywalker has a room that they've dedicated to it, which I think is great. We've talked for years about doing that here, and that may still happen. But in general, yes, I take the speakers, come into the big room, set them up fairly close so you're really just getting the near field effect and try to minimize the effect of the room as much as possible. So yes, it's a compromise. It's not perfect, but I think you still pretty well get the idea of what's falling off and what kind of things need to be attended to.
Another issue you and I spoke about before the show was that of imaging and the difference between the commercial cinema and the home theater in terms of the front speakers. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. In a cinematic environment, of course, the speakers are behind the screen, and they roughly match the image. So if I pan hard left, it goes to the left edge of the screen. If I pan hard right, it goes to the right edge of the screen. And so, that's basically my sound field, my front sound field.
Right.
However, at home, it's a little bit interesting because you have a lot of people, I mean, the majority of setups I've seen actually, is you've got the TV in the middle, and then you put the left and right speakers in the corners, and then you've got the center speaker on top of the TV or somewhere. And it's interesting what happens, because when you make that really hard left pan or that hard right pan, and it goes well outside the image, right? So sometimes it's very disconcerting to be hearing sounds from way over on the left, but basically the image isn't still in front of you.
Yeah. Very, very disconcerting. I agree.
Now, we don't make a complete compensation for that, because you still have a situation where you want it to be able to play in a lot of different environments. And some people actually do have screens with projection and things like that at home. So you don't want to totally make it sound wrong for that. So we try to just make a compromise. If something sounds really odd, we'll pull it in a little bit, or we'll spread it a little bit into the center speaker as well as one side, and try to hit a compromise where it still gives you the real, what director intended basically, but it works better for the small image size.
And then what about EQ? We've talked on this show, and you and I have talked on this show, and others have as well, about this X curve, which is used in commercial cinema. And how do you compensate or deal with that when you're then doing a home mix?
That's a really good question. Part of the misunderstanding, I think, is what the X curve is. I think some people might imagine that, in cinema, the mixers are taking the sounds and, attenuating the treble to match this curve, or that the sound system has been attenuated to match this curve. But the studies that we've done, and I talked about on the last show, we've really discovered that basically the X curve happens if you have a nice flat set of speakers that look really good, manufacturer specs are good, anechoic specs are good, everything like that. You've installed them well into the theater. You put this big white filter in front, and all of a sudden you have an X curve. It's sort of as simple as that. Now, the good mixers really understand what that is. And instead of sitting there and in the theater going, oh, well, you know, I've got to roll off on the treble because of the screen, so I'm going to crank up all this EQ into everything that I've got to try to compensate for what the screen's doing. And then, of course, if I brought that home, then the treble would be screaming out of the speakers, right? And
right.
I'd have to
you get a haircut easily.
Yeah. And I did find in the very beginning of when I started to do this that there were more mixes that were like that. And I think that, you know, when we were in the analog days, it was pretty common for mixers to just sort of continually add a little top end, a little top end, a little top end every generation because, you know, the mag or the tape would wear off some of that high end and everybody sort of got used to that, right? Plus you have the noise reduction that's tied in with that, which also tends to attenuate the really upper frequencies as well. So what I found when I first started mixing is that there were more movies like that where they would just tear your head off, right? But screens were kind of worse then too. Screens have gotten better over time. I mean, they're still not great, but they're much better than they used to be. They're,
and you're, by that you mean the acoustic transparency of the screen.
Yeah,
the ability for the sound to get from the screen, from the speaker through the screen and out into the room. They're still not perfect, I agree.
Yeah,
but they're better,
perfect.
You're saying.
They're better than they were, say, I don't know if you've ever studied any of this. There used to be something called an Academy curve, which came about because the screens were so thick and everything, you know, in the early days that you couldn't, the only way to get sound through them was just to crank the living hell out of the treble. And then if you go back and listen to those mixes today, they're practically unlistenable, right?
Right.
You have to do a tremendous amount of equalization to try to back off. And then when the X curve actually came in, at the time that was an extension from the Academy curve. So there was actually, Academy curve was really narrow. The X curve kind of went more out, right? So you actually got more than you had then.
Right.
Screens got a little better, sound systems got better, blah, blah, blah. So as that's happened, mixers have felt less need. But I actually think that as time has gone on and more mixers have heard their material at home, which is where the ultimate judge of just about everything is anymore, the mixers have realized, you know, I'm not going to crank all that treble in there because it just doesn't sound good, you know, once I take it out of the theater. So the good mixers, I find they just very judiciously, you know, EQ the sounds they need to, leave other sounds alone, try to keep it so it doesn't get screechy. You know what I mean? Because once you start cranking a lot of high end in, even in the theater, it'll get really screechy. The speakers will start breaking up, and it's extremely painful on the ears. And so, you know, I think over time, the good mixers, really understand that no, I don't have to compensate for the X curve. This is essentially, quote unquote, what cinema sounds like. You have a screen, you're not going to get those really top end sizzly frequencies that I really like to hear at home, those nice silky highs. They're just not going to get through the screen. But rather than sit there and, you know, try to crank up all this treble that's just really going to kind of mess with you in other ways and lower your headroom, I think they've just sort of understand, okay, this is what cinema sounds like. I just make it sound good for cinema. And then guess what? When I listen to it on a set of flat speakers, it sounds fine. Right?
Well,
so in general, I don't go in and apply a big attenuation these days. Certain sounds, like certain sounds will poke out, you know, when you're listening on near field speakers, you know, with nice tweeters and stuff as opposed to through a screen. Certain sounds might poke out, but it's not a general thing where all of a sudden I'm like reaching for the EQ and putting in an attenuation to try to keep it from tearing your head off.
Mahler Music brings up a point here related about the X curve in an AV receiver. He says, my THX AVR, I think, puts an X curve on my audio. I always wondered if mixers tested the mix in THX mode or Dolby or whatever. And that gets me back to the question of, do you sometimes, in your home theater system that you set up to do these, are you using professional electronics or consumer electronics?
Well, the Genelecs have what I would call
well, those are professional, yeah,
and those are self-powered and all like that. And then the TV is just the TV. So at the moment, I'm not actually setting up an off-the-shelf home theater system that might have a THX or a Dolby X curve thing in there. I don't know. I've never found the benefit in those at home for most of well-mixed movies today. I don't know that they're that helpful. Some people argue that they're necessary, and certainly they're features in that equipment, and fine. But I personally haven't really found the need to use it.
Right. I would agree in general. It's probably better to disable such features because the mixers, such as yourself and your teams, kind of know what they're doing and will deliver the best possible result without having to muck around with it too much in the consumer product at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. Well, good.
So, another question?
Blue Rules. Yeah, Blue Rules actually brings up the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is immersive audio. We have two basic flavors, three sort of. Dolby Atmos is probably the most well-known. Oro 3D is another one. And now DTSX has entered the mix, so to speak, if you will permit me that bad joke. And Blue Rules asks, would people do mixes would your team, for example, for the home, do a mix in Dolby Atmos or DTSX, even if they weren't released in Atmos or DTSX in the theater?
Well, that's extremely interesting, actually. If it was the way the landscape seems to currently be, if it's a new movie and it has already received an immersive mix for the theater, whether it be any of those flavors or all of them, then we will usually carry that forward, and I'll do a home theater mix, for a home release in those formats as well. So we'll try to stay consistent with that. For older movies that, this was before immersive sound happened, right?
Yep.
There are some select titles that are going to be coming up that I'm actually remixing in immersive sound.
Interesting. Wow. Well, there you go. There's the answer to that question. Now, in terms of immersive sound generally, this is a topic I wanted to talk to you about. The differences between mixing for the cinema versus mixing for that at home. Now we have these different formats, and that's another part of the problem for you, I think, which I'd love for you to address here and talk about a little bit, is when you have three different formats, are you going to mix separately for all of them, or are you going to be able to do one immersive mix and apply it to these three, say, different formats? How's that going to work?
Well, the "gonna work" is the operative word there. As it stands today, as we stand today, each of those three formats requires its own mix, its own delivery bit stream, its own authoring, the whole thing. You have to completely do it from scratch. So if I'm going to do an Atmos, I have to mix it in an Atmos. I have to create an Atmos bit stream. I have to author that Atmos bit stream onto the Blu-ray, and it has to be played through a receiver that has a chip that understands Atmos. And similarly for RO, and similarly for DTS. So at the moment, you're in a position of needing to do mixes for each. Now, the biggest differences, of course, are the RO and the Atmos, because the speaker situations are very different between the two, and sort of what they're trying to accomplish, I think, is very different.
Yeah.
So in cinema at the moment, we're doing mixes for each one, and then we're taking those and taking the stems that we created in the immersive domain, bringing those in and rebalancing those for a similar situation. So the Atmos setup that is used for home mixing is what they call 7+4. So you've got a 7.1 on the horizontal plane, just like you normally would a 7.1, and then you've got four speakers on the ceiling, two kind of in front of you and two behind you.
Right.
So that's sort of the setup you mix to if you're going to do a home Atmos. If you're going to do a home RO, they use kind of a 9.1 for their home, where the left speaker, right speaker, and both surround speakers get another speaker stacked up on top of them on a pole.
Right. At an
So,
elevation of about 30 degrees, they
about
recommend.
30, exactly. So if you've got that 30 degree that you're just talking about between the level of the, the horizontal speakers and then the height speakers, as they call them, if they can be like 30 degrees above you, I've got those 4 speakers. It's pretty remarkable how good that sounds. I mean, you really get a feeling of height. It's pretty interesting how good that really works. It's impressive.
How do you compare the two then? Oro with speakers at about 30 degrees height versus Atmos that have speakers actually overhead in the ceiling. You've heard them both, obviously. Do they both have strengths and weaknesses? Is one clearly preferable in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I really do like both formats. I think they were both designed to kind of hit a little bit of a different idea. The RL system was kind of designed to, take existing what you already had and add a height layer to it to give you that sensation of that third dimension, the height dimension over your head. And then in some installations, they've also got what's been called a voice of God, which is a similar mono channel over the top, which is nice. And it adds some extra stuff, but I think the majority of what happens in that system are the height speakers. And you really do get that feeling of having things over your head. But the RO system is basically like a 2 stacked 5.1 systems, right? You got your regular 5.1, you got another 5.1 on top, or 5.0 on top of it. So They really were thinking about it as adding another height layer to what you already had going in your regular 5.1. The Atmos system kind of came from another angle. They were thinking more about the movement of objects and taking individual sounds and being able to address that sound all over the room and do a fairly discrete motion. Every single speaker in an Atmos system is individually addressable, including the speakers that are overhead, whereas the RL system is arrays. Just the surround parts of it are arrays, just like they are in a regular 5.1. So they really were designed for different things. So it's a little bit hard to just absolutely say, well, I like this one better than that one. I like that one better than that one, because I think different things seem to pop out differently on the two systems. And if it's a movie that really has a lot of height and overhead information, I really like what the RO does. If it's a movie that the main deal is I've got a lot of sound design where I'm moving objects around and I've got very positioned things in the room, then the Atmos does that better. So but it really depends on what you're looking for, and they enhance the movie a little bit differently, for that reason. So, but getting back to your original question, at the moment, I would mix individually for each of those systems. Now, DTS doesn't really have a speaker system per se like the other two, or speaker layout. They have some recommendations. If you look there on the DTS site, they'll give you some recommended ways of laying your speakers out. But the format per se is not a speaker layout like the other two are. DTS is more of a delivery mechanism with what they call their multidimensional audio bit stream, and the rendering that is possible from there. I'm going to talk about rendering in a second because that's an important part of immersive sound. So for the DTS, I don't necessarily have to do another mix, but I do need to do I do need to recode it into their bit stream. Right. So I might have a mix that I've already done in my Pro Tools session that I've, mastered for home. And then I might put their plugins into the Pro Tools, and then those plugins will generate the MDA bit stream, which I can then deliver to the home.
A couple of quick questions before you get to rendering, which is an important topic I want to hear you talk about. But one is, for these immersive soundtracks, do you actually bring in overhead or height speakers and put them on poles or put them on frames or trusses or something like that within this larger mixing environment?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So far, the mixes that I've done, we go into a smaller room, like a TV stage type of size, and For the RO, we do the system with the speakers on the poles. For the Atmos system, we usually put the overhead speakers up on trusses or something like that. We're talking about, here at Sony, we're talking about building a custom room that would have both of those systems installed, but in more of a compact way that would be proper for a home theater. So it's very early days right now in terms of immersive mixing for the home.
Yeah, exactly. The other question I had was, certainly doing a separate mix for Atmos and for Oro and for maybe DTS, although as you said, that maybe all that needs is just a different a bit stream, but having to do multiple mixes for a theater obviously costs the studio a lot more money. And I wonder how common that is or will be, given that some movies are released to the theater in Atmos and others, fewer, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, are released in Oro. And so when you convert those soundtracks for the home, wouldn't you only do the one that had been used in the theatrical release?
I would agree that's generally the case. I think it's interesting what you say, though, because I think I mentioned this the last time I was on your show, but there is a project going on in SMPTE, and it's a very earnest project where we're trying to come up with a single delivery bit stream for cinema, so that no matter how you mixed it, you could boil it down to one bit stream that you would put in your DCP, digital cinema package, which is where you deliver to the theater, and then the theater renderer would be able to read that bit stream and play it into whatever speakers the theater happens to have, whether it be an RO setup or a DTS setup or an Atmos setup. It would do kind of its best job to play those. And this is something that the studios really want, because just as you adroitly point out, these extra mixes, these extra inventory, these extra DCPs, keeping track of all these things, all these extra mixes, very costly, very time-consuming, very difficult. And it really, I think, is slowing the growth of immersive sound, because there's such a hassle factor in there, and of course a cost factor in there, that I don't think it's just literally taken off and gone crazy like it could, because when you approach saying, okay, I'm going to do this movie in immersive sound, you're saying I'm going to take on this headache. And of course we love the results, but the headache of actually pulling it off is really intense. And so the studios are really wanting to come to this one bitstream format and so the first place that we're trying to do that is in cinema. And it's a slow go, because it's a political process and everybody's got their ideas, and it certainly hasn't gone as fast as people would like, but we are on the course, and we're really hoping that we'll get there fairly soon, to where we can get to that single deliverable. And the studios really feel like if we can get there and it starts to be pretty much not any more costly or any more hassle to do an immersive mix than a regular one, then I think we can really start to grow the format. But right now, I think it's going to stay as a specialty, just for your tentpole movies or whatever like that, until we can kind of reach that point. So I think that's one of the big reasons the standards are incredibly important. In this case, instead of the standard squashing business, I think the standards are going to help them.
Well, and you're going to come back actually on the show in August to talk about that standardization process in much more detail. So let's not talk about it anymore now, because
that's fine.
It's really important, and we're going to devote a whole show to it. But it's important to mention now because of all the issues that we've been talking about. You were about to wanted to mention something about the renderers. Let's hear what you have to say about that.
So for those that don't know, the renderer is the front-end digital signal processing in front of an immersive audio system that takes the instructions that are contained in the bit stream and decides where to put those sounds within whatever speaker or headphone or whatever setup you've got. Whether it be, you've got a full-blown home theater system with all these speakers, or you just have a sound bar, or you just have a TV, or you're listening through earbuds, or whatever you're doing, this thing which I call the magic renderer is supposed to just kind of, it's the take care of it box. It's like, well, I'll just give it all this information. It'll just take care of it and play it out to whatever system I attach it to.
Sounds pretty magic to me.
Yeah, it's the magic renderer. And it physically will do that. Physically, sound will come out of the speakers. Sound will come out of the headphones. We don't know at this moment how to really predict what it's going to do, right?
Ooh.
Because it's going to be a little different for every situation. Plus, every manufacturer is going to sort of have their idea about how that gets done. There's technology sort of down in your renderer that each company has as sort of their secret sauce that separates this brand from that brand or whatever, all of which in some ways is good, don't get me wrong, but when you're trying to imagine what's going to happen when you take this immersive mix, like say I do mix it in the RO system or the Atmos system for all these speakers, how do I know what's going to happen with that when it gets rendered out to a pair of headphones or gets rendered out to a soundbar, and then which soundbar, right? I mean, so now all of a sudden your choices, your playing field just gets huge, and you're going, wow, I've got so many more options about how this could be heard. How am I going to come up with a mix that's going to satisfy all of these different approaches?
Man, it sounds almost impossible.
It is. I mean, when you just talk about it, it sounds impossible, right? So you have to sort of go down very methodically and say, okay, so what are the really important things that I want to try to capture from this mix? What are the important things that the immersive sound is doing for this particular movie? How have they designed the immersive sound into the overall structure? What is the meaning of it? What's it conveying? If it's mostly height information, if it's mostly a 3D sound field, you might approach it one way. If it's trying to do a whole bunch of very specific object moves, you're going to have to think about it another way. There's various things in there. One of the things that we have to know just physically, the differences in what's possible. For example, in the Atmos system, you have 128 objects that you can use. Right. At any one given instant of time. Right. So it's rare that many get used, but you have that capability. Whereas when you bring it to the home, that goes down by a factor of 10. So all of a sudden you've got 12 objects.
Really? I thought it was more like 32 or 64.
No, it's 12.
It's 12. Wow, a factor of 10.
The recommended number of objects. Now, in a way, that makes sense because you're playing to a much smaller environment. So the difference between having something here and having something 10 degrees away from that in a cinema, you might be able to perceive if you're in a good seat. You'll never hear it at home. And so there's a spatial averaging, if you will, that kind of says, okay, within a certain amount here, I'm just going to take all of that and collapse it into one object, right? And so,
okay.
And there's some logic built into that. The Dolby home renderer has that logic built into it. But regardless if it was the Dolby system or any other, you do have to realize that you're playing to a much smaller playing field, right? So you're going to be bringing your imaging in anyway to have it make sense. Because if you had something that was really, really wide and really, really moving, by the same token as we had what I talked about before with just the left-right pan with the speakers and the TV, multiply that into now I've got all these speakers in the room, I'm doing these big pans. That's just not going to translate most likely. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be bringing that kind of stuff in a little bit and trying to make it still sound good, still that it has the intention, but that it's going to have a better shot at translating not only to the speaker system that I might be using, but say a soundbar. Things, when you start to boil it down to a soundbar, it really gets interesting because all you've really got is those speakers that are under the screen. And of course, soundbars are getting way better now, right? I mean, every iteration of soundbars gets better. And there's immersive soundbars coming out. And of course, they're using a lot of different tricks to sort of trick you into thinking that you've got something coming from above you or behind you or things like that. I call them tricks. They're psychoacoustic phenomena tricks, right?
Yeah.
And they're built in. But we can only at this moment make some educated guesses about how that's going to go. I mean, I'm figuring that for as soon as these sound bars really kind of start to hit, and we start really seeing immersive sound bars out there in a general way, I've got a feeling I'm bringing one into my mixes. That's pretty much going to be the listening, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mahler Music is asking, what can enthusiasts do to make sure that their home theater setups work as close as possible to what you, the mixer, intend for us to hear?
Well, the two things would be speaker placement and calibration. And depending on how good your speakers are, they may need a little bit of equalization one way or the other. You can see on a lot of the websites, there's a lot of recommended ways of setting things up. For example, if you go to the Dolby website, you'll see what the 7.1+4 is, and they've got a lot of recommendations for that. They've got a couple other versions of that with different amounts of speakers. RO has a similar situation. DTS has a similar situation. So I think a lot of that is probably just education. I'm guessing the home theater magazines and things like that, as we start to move into immersive sound, we should probably do some articles that really kind of lay this stuff out for the audiophile.
And in many cases, they already have and will continue to do so, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. Beatmaster asks, can MDA, multidimensional audio, the basis of DTS-X, help dialogue clarity, or does it obscure it with additional effects? And I would expand that question to include, all of the immersive formats.
Well, I don't think the bit stream itself has much to do with that particular thing.
Okay.
Now, there's I do want to mention, in Europe especially, and in some broadcast, objects are used quite differently. They're not used for sound effects and things. They're used for different aspects of the mix. So you've probably seen these demonstrations where they've got the dialogue tied to an object, and you can swap that object out for a foreign language, or there's various sound effects. And so they use objects differently. And so a consumer could theoretically just turn that object up if they wanted to hear more dialogue.
Or dialogue, yeah.
Now, that's a particular usage of objects that really isn't tied to a bit stream as much as it's tied to a usage, right?
Got it.
In your regular cinema movie making, you're not really, I don't think that's playing into a bit stream. I believe maybe what the person's really asking is, I've got all these extra surround speakers and I got all this other sound coming at me, is that going to make it even more difficult for me to hear what's usually coming out of the center speaker? And I would say, yes, there is that potential. And so as a mixer, I think you have to be very cognizant of that when you're creating an immersive mix, to not create so much density that it just takes the person out of the movie of what they're trying to get, which is dialogue in the story. And, just like a lot of things, when things are new, people overdo it, right?
Yeah, right. So. Yeah, I know that story. I would have thought that it might, an immersive sound system, particularly object-oriented, would make it perhaps the dialogue easier to understand, because you can now move everything else into a larger sphere, if you will, and without having to crowd other sound elements around near where the dialogue is coming from. What do you think?
Yeah, my battery died on my headphone, so I didn't quite hear the last thing you said, so I just went to speakers. Sorry for the last couple minutes here.
Sorry, yeah, just a couple minutes. Sorry about that.
I guess I need a new battery.
Yep.
So I missed your question. I'm sorry.
Okay, sure. The question is, I would have thought that with an immersive sound system, object-oriented in particular, mixers would have the opportunity to move things away from the dialogue more than they do with a traditional 5.1 or 7.1, where other sound elements might get kind of crowded into where the dialogue is. But with immersive, you can sort of move those things away more and might improve the dialogue intelligibility.
Yeah, I think one of the nicest things, one of the nicest uses of immersive sound is to spread what used to have to be all taken up by the front speakers, and which means those speakers are trying to do a lot of stuff. Removing that out into the room a little bit and that really clears up what's coming out of those speakers. And so, you're right on with that. There's an effect that a lot of mixers like to use, which has been dubbed the proscenium effect, which is that they use the speakers that are the closest to the screen on the side walls and above the screen, and they take things that would be in the screen speakers, and they take them off the screen, so to speak, and put them into those channels that are right around the screen, right? And by doing so, it frees up a lot of what's on the screen, and it brings it out into the room a little bit, and all of a sudden you can concentrate a lot more on what's really coming out of the screen. So that mixing technique that you're talking about is actually a very positive one, and a lot of the mixers are starting to explore that now.
Rusty Bones asks a question that takes us into our last main topic of discussion here, which is how will audio mastering be affected if and or when physical media goes away? You and I talked offline about the impact that streaming movies, which is now obviously a huge thing from Netflix and Amazon and Vudu, a lot of other places. How does that affect what you do?
Well, at the moment it doesn't, but I think that as we start to move more and more from, physical delivery to streaming, I think we are going to have to probably take that into effect. But the interesting thing is, it used to be that the only thing that people would stream would be, say, onto their computer speakers or onto their phone or something. But now you're finding people are streaming directly into their, good sounding home speakers.
Yep.
Right. So the fact is, you're still listening on good speakers. You're still listening at a regular volume. The only difference with the streaming is that of course, the bit rates are much lower.
And presumably the quality isn't as good. Just by the nature of the fact that the bit rate, the bandwidth is much lower.
Yeah, in general. So does that affect the mixing? That's a little bit tough, because just because you lower the bit rate, of course, that does make it sound worse, but that's not a predictable thing where you can say, well, I'm going to be listening to this at 192K, and so at 192K, well, that means I should probably boost this up and make sure that's happening and change this and compensate for that, because it's a little bit unpredictable, right? All of these codecs that are doing the what they call a perceptual coding, they're all making their own particular assumptions about what's going to happen when you throw away certain data to try to get it down to those smaller bit rates. So I find differences in the way that the different codecs behave, well, not behave, but the way they sound to me when I listen at those small bit rates. Some of them tend to compensate a little on their own for different things and blah, blah, blah. So I'm not exactly sure what I would do from the mixing perspective. I think the question is a little bit more, would I start to be thinking about a mix specifically for mobile devices or something that has very, very small speaker, presumably tinny, doesn't have a lot of, low end.
Not a lot of bass coming out of a speaker from an iPhone.
Exactly. So, that's more of the question, I think. If we're going to start, if that's going to be the way people consume things, is it eventually going to be worth doing a mix for that format? At the moment, no. But, we'll kind of have to see how it goes.
Yeah. And you also mentioned that the first widely adopted delivery mechanism for immersive audio is probably going to be streaming more than Blu-ray. Although we do have some Blu-rays out now with Dolby Atmos. I think we've reached 20 titles, I think, something like that. Oro, quite a bit fewer. But do you think it's going to roll out in a streaming format more quickly?
Well, the reason I think that it will is because streaming is kind of application-based. You basically have a particular application that creates the stream, and the same application receives the stream. So you have kind of an end-to-end solution. Netflix has their codecs, and all the rest of them, Hulu, everybody's got their own sort of end-to-end.
And everybody at the consumer end has an app, a Netflix app in a device, or a YouTube or Hulu or Vudu or whatever. So as you say, you have to have the specific app. And one thing I've found is that even the user interface experience is different with the Netflix app on a Panasonic device versus a Samsung device, say, or stuff like that. So there may be other differences as well that are less obvious.
Yeah, I would agree with you. But the reason I think it's going to roll out quicker is it's a lot easier to just download an application and say, okay, stream me, and just there it is, and it works, right? With when you start talking about Blu-ray, now we have to have a receiver to decode it and a sound system, so there's just more infrastructure involved. And as we all probably know, there's another generation of Blu-ray coming out eventually that's going to be able to do, high dynamic range imaging and all that kind of stuff. And immersive sound is certainly intended to be a part of that. Right now, I think we're kind of in an experimental phase where they're starting to put immersive sound on standard Blu-rays with the picture image that we now have. So it'll be very interesting to see. But I just think that usually most consumers, if all I have to do is download an app, press a button, give it to me, that's pretty quick. That works. Yeah,
I agree. Streaming is also likely to be, well, it already is the first way that we are seeing Ultra HD, which, as you mentioned, there is a new Blu-ray standard coming. It's just been finalized, called Ultra HD Blu-ray, which will have the higher resolution. It'll have the high dynamic range. It'll also have immersive audio, which current Blu-ray can do. But I think in the Ultra HD Blu-ray, that's going to be a primary feature. And so what happens then to your job is going to be very interesting as well, if anything. Maybe it won't affect it at all.
Well, I think what a lot of people are calling the next generation of entertainment is all of those things together, right? It's the higher dynamic range image, the contrast, the immersive sound, the wider color gamut, everything kind of as an item. Then you say, okay, I've got that. Now this is a premium experience. I can charge more for it. So my guess is the streaming services will also jump on this fairly quickly. And because, TVs are already coming out that can play high dynamic range images. So I think the pairing of immersive sound with high dynamic range and 4K and all that, or UHD, all that same kind of thing makes the next gen experience a premium package. I can charge more for it. No brainer.
The Fixer's making a good comment in the chat room. I think that because the operating system for each TV or device is different, that may be why the user experience and maybe even the performance of these apps is different. Once TVs all start using a standard like Android TV, and we've started to see some companies now use Android as the operating system for their TV, or Apple HomeKit or whatever the Fixer says, then we will see apps become standardized across various product lines as well. I think that's a good point.
And I think it's like anything else, apps are kind of an interesting thing. I mean, if you run an app on an iPhone and you run an app on an Android, it used to be they were extremely different experiences. Now they're pretty similar experiences, right?
Yeah.
So people are starting to learn how to code these things in that fashion, and I think we'll start to see a similar thing in the TV world.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've come to the end of a great hour of conversation, and I thank you so much. I'm looking forward very much to you coming back in August when, as I said before, you'll be talking about the process of standardizing the creation of an immersive sound mix so that the studios, and you in particular in your job, don't have to do it a bunch of times. You can do it once and deliver something standard, and then it can be rendered any way you want, depending on what renderer and what speaker layout you have and whatever. It's going to be a really great thing. SMPTE is working on that, and SMPTE has been kind enough to help us work on getting you here to talk about that. And I guess other standards bodies as well, right? I mean, this is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, people are definitely, especially in the home arena, they're looking to do it. You have MPEG-H and these other things in the home area. Right now in cinema, we're trying to come up with that one magic, bit stream that fits all. And there's a lot of qualified bit streams, so we're just going to have to see how it goes. Or we start from scratch and we get out the pencil and paper and we just write one.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing about that. Yeah, we'll look forward to hearing about that in the next couple months. But thanks so much for being here. This has been a great conversation.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott.
That's Brian Vessa, the Executive Director of Audio Mastering at Sony Pictures. You can, of course, find out more about Sony Pictures at sonypictures.com. You can always find me at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv. And you can follow me on Twitter at HTGeekScott and at AVS Forum. And you can find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks, as always, right here at twit.tv/HTG and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TwitHomeTheaterGeeks. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Smith Freeman, the chief speaker designer at SVS, which is a company that makes some really, really nice speakers at really, really great prices. Lots of value there, very highly regarded, not a lot of money. I'm going to be talking with Smith about how the heck does he do that. So I hope you will tune in for it. Until then, geek out.